Hi guys, welcome to the Revive Stronger podcast. I'm your host as always, Steve Hall, and I'm very happy to have Lyle McDonald back on the show. So it's been a few months since Lyle was on the show, and he is now, we're just speaking, and he's much more recovered than he was since last time. And obviously the recovery book that Lyle produced has come out, so hopefully a lot of you have maybe picked that up since last time we spoke. And I think the majority, if not every single person listening to this podcast, will know who Lyle McDonald is. So I want to, if you don't, then definitely check out the episode before, and definitely check out Lyle's website, bodyrecomposition.com, because it's fantastic. And you could literally be on there for months upon months to just read through all those articles. So today I wanted to get Lyle on because I'd spoken with Broderick, who I've been consulting with, who's a friend of Lyle's, and they talk a lot. And we kind of came onto the subject of refeeds. And Broderick suggested that I get Lyle back on the show to talk about them in depth, because Lyle is kind of his go-to guy when it comes to diet, nutrition, that sort of thing. So without further ado, I wanted to get Lyle back on the show and talk about refeed. So Lyle, I don't know where you want to start, but maybe defining a refeed in your eyes?
So first, a little history. So in 2004, I wrote this book called A Guide to Flexible Dieting. And again, I always like to bring this up. It wasn't a new idea. I honestly think I was one of the first people to truly formalize it in that sense, in terms of the research. At the time, nobody listened, because it was just, what do you mean you don't have to be 100%? What do you mean you don't have to diet like this? Now, of course, nobody talks about anything else. I was actually at a big fitness expo months ago, and there was actually a little booth, and it was like, flexible dieting, we'll teach you how to eat. And I really wanted to go up and go, have you heard of a guy named Lyle McDonald? Just to see if, anyway. So in that book, I described a bunch of different strategies during dieting. One was a free meal, just a single meal to break your diet, just to deal with the psychology and the cravings. The other end, I described a full diet break, which was a 1 to 2 week span between active dieting periods. And then there's this thing in the middle, and that was called a refeed. And basically what it represented was some time period of high carbohydrate, high calorie intake. And the idea was to basically sort of reset some of the hormonal adaptations to dieting, right? This was leptin, which is, the hormone is still critically important. Discovered in 94. I think I got into it in the early 2000s. It's a big player in the slowing of metabolic rate, the increase in hunger, the decrease in thyroid, the decrease in reproductive hormones. Leptin is the controller on this, especially when it goes down on a diet. And basically the study showed that in the short term, leptin is released from fat cells, and it's predominantly related to how much body fat you have, but it's also related to both calorie and especially carbohydrate intake. So in the very short term, it's mainly carbohydrate intake. So, right, you diet for 7 days, your leptin levels will drop by 50%. Clearly, you have not lost 50% of your body fat, although that would be fantastic. And then over the rest of it, so it drops super quickly as due to carbohydrates and calories, and then it drops super, super slowly related to body fat loss. Well, the fact is it works the same way in reverse, is if you put a bunch of carbohydrates and calories into the system, leptin goes up more quickly than body fat, right? So the idea at the time was, okay, well, if dropping leptin is coordinating all these adaptations to dieting, and it is, right? They've done studies. If you inject leptin if you diet someone down, right, metabolic rate slows down, thyroid, blah, 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 and you inject them with leptin to pre-diet levels, almost all of that reverses, right? Unfortunately, leptin just never got out of the research stage except to treat amenorrhea in females. Even if you could get it, it's about $500 a day the last time I looked for effective dose. So realistically, it's probably never going to be used clinically outside of that one. And they use it in some disease states. So basically, it was like, how can we manipulate this with diet? So if carb, again, drops fast because of calories and carbs, but you can sort of get it to spike back up. So that was the premise. I found research that as little as 5 hours of carbohydrate overfeeding would raise leptin. And of course, the longer you eat, the more it goes up, right? So 5 hours is good. 1 day is better. 2 days, as I'll talk about, is probably better. Obviously, if you never diet, that's the best of all, but you don't tend to lose fat very effectively doing it that way. Like at some point, you have to find a balance between physiological benefits and being on a diet and actually losing the body fat that you want. So that's kind of the basic premise. Some time frame where you're going to deliberately increase calories. I do want to distinguish and this will seem pedantic, but it's not in my mind. You will still hear people talk about doing a cheat day.
Yeah.
Right. And I don't like that term. I don't like cheat meal for a couple reasons. One is that we already have this rigid dieting psychology. Good foods, bad foods. I'm on a diet. I'm off a diet. It adds this morality to it. Yeah. And I guess you got an argument on some with Facebook, and this person was like, well, I don't see a cheat as a negative. I'm like, right, when you cheat on your spouse, that's good. When you cheat on your taxes, when you cheat on a test, cheating has no positive connotations. So people automatically, it's putting this into this mindset. This day is a negative when it should be looked at as a positive. And I'll talk about refeeds have other potential benefits other than just hormonal. And so that's the first reason. The second reason is I find that when people conceptualize it as a cheat, they almost go out of their way to see how much crap they can put down their gullet, right? It becomes, and I did this, make no mistake, I did this when I was younger. I did the early body opus diet, and my refeeds that started with lots of carbohydrates and starches. Suddenly it was, I want a dozen donuts, and you get real sloppy with it. There's kind of some famous stories. So back in the day, there's a book called Body for Life, written by Bill Phillips, who ran Muscle Media 2000. It was actually one of the better books. It took a very weight training, high protein, moderate carbs, whatever. Like, it was very hard to argue what was in there because he was a bodybuilder. But for the time, it was very, very ahead of the game. And he said, 24 hours every week, you can have a cheat day. And there were stories of people that, I kid you not, would wake up at 12:01 a.m. and eat till 11:59 p.m., right? That's a day. That's what he said. And then they're like, why did I stop losing fat? So I think thinking of it in those negative terms, with that negative terminology, does way more harm than good. So I prefer to call it a structured refeed, right? So again, high carbohydrates. The original goal was actually multifold. Part of it was psychological, right? People crave foods on a diet, and let's face it, we tend to crave carbohydrates. Like if you're eating enough protein, you don't crave meat. Even dietary fat. I mean, if you crave fat, it's along with carbs. You crave junk foods. You know what? I'm not using that in a negative term. You know what I mean by that. Whatever. Snack foods, let's use as a better term. But let's face it, when you're moderating carbs or restricting carbs, you crave carbs. Eric Helms actually told me about a study I had missed where they put two groups, exact same diet, except one group got to eat bread. Yeah. That was it. That was the only difference. And the group without bread, guess what they craved? Right, bread. And so it's stuff like that. So by having this day where you can raise calories, raise carbohydrates, and I'll talk about why I'm focusing on carbs so much, you get to sort of fill those cravings, right? If you're an if it fits your macros person, you can do that. And I mention that because for many, as much as the if it fits your macros thing, and I'll assume your listeners know what that is. Yeah. Well, okay, quickly. If not, it means that within the context of your calories, protein, carbs, and fat, if you want to have a little bit of a treat, if it fits those macros. Okay, moving on. For smaller dieters, and for women especially, and realize that I am now legally required to mention women's issues because this damn book I've wired in for 3.5 years, is smaller women on very low calories. If it fits your macros is great, but it's usually larger men, right? Yeah. If you only have 1,300 calories and you eat a Pop-Tart rather than something filling, you're starving to death, right? So they may not be able to do that. Some people find that free meals just kick them off their diet. They don't have any physiological benefit. They don't like whatever. So this day, if you want a treat, you've got the calories to work with. You've got the carbs to work with. You want to have a frozen yogurt, whatever it is. So it solves that psychology partly. There's also the issue during dieting. And again, I'm focusing here mainly on people who are lifting and doing high intensity exercise, right? If you're pissing off with doing nothing but low intensity cardio, or you're enduro or whatever, this doesn't matter so much. But carbohydrate stores get depleted and your training intensity suffers. If nothing else, it refills muscle glycogen. So there are multiple purposes to this. Mm-hmm. Now, just to finish up with kind of the physiology, The reason I emphasize carbs is that in the short term, it's actually carbohydrate. Like dietary fat doesn't have this quite the same effect on leptin as carbs do in the short term, like over 2 or 3 days. And this is the time frame we're talking about. Over longer periods, it's not as big of a deal. But if you're trying to have an impact on leptin metabolism, predominantly in fat cells, if you want to get really up your butt, for any of the technically minded people, go look up the hexosamine biosynthetic pathway. This is the biochemistry within the fat cell. Carbs feed into this, and as I like to say, a bunch of stuff happens, and basically this is what lets the fat cell know, you've got calories coming in, you can increase leptin. So it's the HBP, the hexosamine biosynthetic pathway, if you get really bored someday. So that's why carbs, and again, fat doesn't refill muscle glycogen. I'm not saying don't eat any fat. However, the majority of the calorie increase needs to come from carbs. Refills glycogen. You can have some fat to have some snack foods, but mostly carbs. So that's the basic physiology. And again, the idea was, like I said, raise leptin with the hopes that, right, leptin sends a signal to the brain. Again, it tells it how much fat tells it how much fat you've got, body fat, how much you're eating. And when those go down, your body goes adapt. Mm-hmm. So the idea is that if falling leptin causes those adaptations, increasing leptin should reverse them. That was the premise. And in 2004, I was super enthusiastic about it. Like, the data was just kind of novel. And I'll be honest, researchers hadn't looked at this, right? They were figuring out leptin for the physiology, and they tend not to think in these terms. Like in most diet studies, they don't think in terms of, it's funny, the new intermittent caloric restriction studies are doing effectively what I was talking about in 2004, but it took them a while. But they weren't even doing it for hormonal reasons. They're doing it for adherence reasons. Mm-hmm. There's only one study I'm aware of, and in it they took overweight women and they put them on one of 3 different diets. It was like low calorie, super low calorie, protein sparing, modified fast, and like leptin just cratered for all 3. And then over a week, they started to gradually refeed. Now, I realized that they were still in a deficit, and these were also obese women. But as they did this, leptin started to recover over that week, and they kept losing fat. So at least in that one, and again, obese women, not lean dieters, at least kind of proof of concept that it is possible to raise leptin and start to reverse those effects while continuing to lose body fat. Now, that's not really the goal of the refeed, although as I talk about Ultimate Diet 2, you can get some magic tricks for about 24 hours. If you deplete muscle glycogen completely and then jack in a ton of carbs for a day, your body will store the carbs and keep burning body fat. That was one of the little metabolic tricks I put into UD2. Regardless, that was the idea. And I presented a 5-hour refeed, which is kind of weird. It makes it kind of a diet day and kind of it's weird structure to the day. Then I had a 1-day refeed, and then I had a 2-day refeed, and which you chose depended on a bunch of stuff, how much training you were doing, how big of a deficit, how lean you were. I had this really complicated chart, Guide to Flexible Dieting, because that all plays a role. Mm-hmm. If you are 40% body fat, not doing a lot of training, you don't need, and also the frequency, you don't need as big of a refeed as often. You're not seeing the same adaptations. If you're at 10% body fat, training 5 days a week in the weight room, very different, and not even on a moderate deficit, very different situation, and you may need a moderate, and I'll get into this in the end, a moderate refeed more frequently or a larger refeed less frequently, and I'll talk about sort of what. So anyway, so that was the idea. So everybody loved it. Game excuse to eat carbs seemed to work as much as anything else, and I hate to fall back on it looked like it worked. The fact is now 13 years later, I look back and there's more research and I've thought about it, and I mentioned this in one of my books, is I was overzealous about it, especially in terms of the shorter refeeds. Mm-hmm. I'll explain why that's the case. But again, I was young, so it goes. The research was very exciting. I no longer think the 5-hour refeed does anything physiologically. It certainly refills muscle glycogen. It gives you a break. Like, I'm not saying it does. It's not useful. It probably is not sending a useful signal to the brain. And here's why I'm gonna explain why that is. So, in contrast to mice and rats, where a single meal has a profound effect, right? Mm-hmm. A mice misses a meal, that's huge. It lives 2 years, right? Like one meal for a mouse is like days for a human. There's actually, I think, is it hummingbirds? There's some little tiny animal, like if it misses a meal, it dies. Like it's that, it doesn't store body fat. It's got such high energy requirements, like, because when you only live for 6 months, a meal might as well be, like, for a human, that's like a month without food. And when you're lean, you're dead. So they know, or we know, so like they do all these silly studies and they're like, oh, we gave them one workout and they didn't get hungrier. Exercise doesn't increase hunger. Okay, please. Or like, we dieted them for 2 days and they didn't get hungry. I'm like, right, because there's a delay.
Yeah.
What you typically see in the research when they measure this stuff is it's about day 3 or 4 where suddenly you start to see compensation, where appetite goes up, where food intake may go up. And it's true of exercise too. There's a delay in this. And again, given humans' long lifespans, and given, our proposed evolutionary food availability, this makes sense. Like if you're, let's say, so go back to evolutionary, and I hate the paleo stuff, but whatever, this was what we evolved under. Fine, you can't find food for a day. If your body just adapted completely, well, there might be food tomorrow. There might be food in a couple of days. If there's no food for 4 or 5 days, probably there's a food shortage. Adaptations. Right? So we know there's this delay on the way down. Well, that got me thinking that there's probably a delay on the way back up, right? So again, reverse the logic. Let's say you haven't eaten for 4 days, and all of a sudden on day 5, whatever, you kill a bison or find a hunt, whatever food you find, however you want to conceptualize it. Well, it wouldn't make any more sense for the body to go, aha, food is available, reverse the adaptations, because this may be a one-time thing.
Yeah.
Once you've had food again for several days, the body can go, okay, and it gets much. I'm using the body isn't like thinking. I'm using those terms very colloquially to go, the body senses a change in leptin that signals it, blah, 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 blah. This way is faster. So as I thought about that, and again, I mentioned this in Ultimate Diet too, as the more I thought about it, the more I realized, yeah, you know what? I bet you need longer periods with higher calories. And unfortunately, the time frame isn't there, right? This is a research, it's not a problem, but when you do studies, unless you're measuring stuff every day, they always wait long enough to make sure they can measure a difference. So it's like, we checked them at week 1 and week 4. We checked them at day 1 and day 7. And they see a difference, but you don't know when. It might have been boom and then dropped. It could have been continuous. You never really know unless they do it on a day-to-day basis. And the data really doesn't exist. So I can't say exactly how long it needs to be, other than I'll fall back on some anecdotes. Just realize that's all they are. I'm not saying they're proof of anything. There is some data on an unpublished paper that I actually helped on the design with a little bit. Can't talk about it because it's not published, but that will at least speak to that. Finding out that we're doing studies on physique athletes, I think you're going to start to see some people who are both researchers and are familiar with these ideas. Eric Trexler, someone else at Lane Norton, they wrote a review paper on this a while back, and they mentioned these concepts and said these are frequently used. The data is not really there, and I don't disagree with that. So there's there's more coming. I do think the intermittent caloric restriction stuff is at least supportive. And if you're not familiar with that, basically they're having overweight people alternate very big deficit days for anywhere from like 1 to 4 days with a normal eating day, and diet for a little while. So they're, rather than constant caloric restriction, rather than just eating the same low amount, they're going low, 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 spike, low, low, spike on whatever, or the alternate day fasting stuff. And I think some of those studies are at least illustrative, if not, they don't seem to be measuring metabolic rate too much, but I think that data will. So anyway, so that's kind of where I've changed from 2004. And even in between that time frame, I was thinking that maybe the shorter times wouldn't work. And I've discussed this with Eric quite extensively in terms of what he's seen in practice. And I actually have come across a couple studies that do speak to this, which are, of course, on women, because again, that's what I have to talk about. So there's a researcher named Anna Lukes, and she's the one that basically demonstrated that the major inductor of women's menstrual cycle dysfunction is what she calls low energy availability. And by that, it's the difference in calorie intake and exercise energy expenditure, right? The remainder is the calories that the body sees to cover things like keeping your heart beating, muscle tone, blood flow, brain. When there's not enough of that, the body will shut down non-essential things. Mm-hmm. For women, that's reproductive function. People have often lost hair with extreme diets. Stuff that's not critical to keep you living gets turned off. So first she did all these studies and determined that it worked this way, that there was a critical threshold below which problems started, yada, yada, yada. Actually, hang on. Let me put a pin in that. I want to go back. I talked about the time frame on all this stuff.
Yeah.
One of the few studies I'm aware of, and it's really more relevant to the diet break. They've done a lot of work where they just torture like Navy SEALs. It's always these really extreme military studies because the military does a lot of this work. Mm-hmm. And they basically just made these guys suffer for like weeks. They're sleeping like 2 hours a day. They're carrying a pack. They're force marching most of the day, and they're eating like 600 calories a day of MREs. It's not bodybuilding style stress, but it's not far off. They call it, it's a multi-stressor environment. So, and they end up at 4% body fat. Testosterone levels are castrate. Thyroid is down 40%. Cortisol is off the map. IGF-1, it's the same adaptations to dieting. And one study showed that with a week of refeeding, if you replace their calories to maintenance, everything, now they regain body fat. However, everything basically normalizes. So we know that somewhere between a day and a week, or we know that a week is sufficient, and that's the diet break. So back to the Ann Luke studies. So in animals, they've done these very similar studies. Starve them, reproductive system shuts down, refeed them. Real easy to do. And in animals, 1 day of calorie increase will do the job. Again, remember, animals, much faster time frame. A day in a mouse's life is about 7 days in a human's life. A day in a rat's life is something like 3 to 4 days. And you tend to see that scaling about right. So then she was like, all right, let's try this. So she did her standard study. She manipulated energy availability, which means you either keep exercise the same and decrease calories, or keep calories the same and increase exercise. And those are effectively identical. There's some small differences. And then she refed these women for a day. And when I say refed, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head. It was like a stupid amount of calories. It was like 25 calories a pound in 1 day. They just plugged the cat and cheese liquid calorie. Awesome. How do I get it? How do I get into these 1,000-calorie overfeeding studies so I can get fat for science? Just awesome. And no effect. It did not. And she's looking at not leptin. She's looking at what's something called luteinizing hormone pulsatility. But this is all interrelated. Leptin controls this stuff. Just like leptin reverses dieting adaptations. If you inject leptin into women that have what's called hypothalamic amenorrhea, they will regain a menstrual cycle, most of them. So leptin is still the fundamental signal, right? She does 5 days of very low energy availability, which again feeds into that it's got to be long enough. She did this 1 day of just monster overfeeding, no effect. So, that would seem to argue against a day having any effect, although I'll come back to this. Another study wasn't even looking at this. They weren't even looking at refeeding. They were just looking at the same sort of effect. Now, what they did 3 days of total fasting, right? They just didn't eat at all. And in a fit of boredom one day, I actually sat down and tried to figure out what the rough total calorie deficit was for the two different studies. Because on the 5-day study, it was an 800 calorie deficit or nothing, whatever the numbers were. And then I was like, well, these women weighed about this much. Probably their energy expenditure is about this much. You take it all out, and fascinatingly, the numbers were almost the same, right? So it's again in that leptin is sensing calorie deficit, especially carb deficit in the short term. It would seem to be related to the total deficit, just like the number of calorie deficit, because 3 days of fasting and 5 days of low calories had the same effect. And in a true fit of boredom, and I haven't put this out there, I actually sat down and mathed out how often you needed to do a refeed based on your deficit, how many calories that would be, when it would achieve this number. And I'm actually pretty impressed with myself. The 2004 flexible dieting that I've told people are like, how did you come up with the frequencies? And I'm like, 50% research, 50% experience, 50% guessing, and 50% luck. And I don't care that that's 200%. Really, that was the case. I was just kind of eyeballing it based on what we'd seen in the research. I got closer than I should have based on a lot more guessing than I want to admit. Like, within a couple of days. So anyway, so they did this, and 3 days, same effect. And then they just said they brought them to maintenance. And then for whatever reason, they happened to remeasure. And 2 days reversed it. So these two studies, one of which was deliberate and one of which was accidental, basically found 1 day doesn't get it, 1 day every 5 doesn't get it done. 2 days, again, for the same size deficit, 2 days does. Again, feeds right back. 5 hours, forget it. Refill glycogen, psychological, cravings, if it fits your macros. I've seen people go, oh, I have one cheat meal to reset my metabolism. Not unless you eat 80,000 calories. Not unless you're doing the 10, and even then, probably not. One meal doesn't do anything. 5 hours doesn't do anything. These studies seem to suggest that 1 day doesn't do anything, but with one caveat on that. So anyway, so that's kind of the basic premise of, and again, from an evolutionary biological standpoint, that kind of makes sense. What we don't know is, how, unfortunately, no one has done the study I want to see, which is do 5 days of low calories, 2 days, and then go back to low calories to see how quickly it comes back. Like, does it immediately reinduce the adaptations? Do you get the same delay? Like, it hasn't been done. So again, we fall back on anecdotes. My ultimate diet too, which again, I was mainly taking an earlier diet and trying to cram it into 7 days, ended up having what structure? It was about 4.5 days of dieting. It's about 2.5 days of refeeding. Basically, I just got lucky. And honestly, women haven't used that diet as much, but honestly, it's probably more optimized for women than for men. I mean, it works for both, but I've seen too many people use that. Their fat loss doesn't stall, their performance. Some make PRs, some gain muscle. But again, I would love to tell you that I just had it was luck. I just happened to kind of get to the right place through a different pathway, and the science, came later. So that's kind of the basics of where my thoughts have changed. Now we talk about application, right? So the simple conclusion would be you must do 2 days of refeeding to have a benefit. And that is one potential conclusion. However, one of the things Eric and I have discussed fairly endlessly, like he and I have just kind of some ongoing email conversations, because he's contributed to the women's book. He's been dieting men and women for, all year, and he's tried a lot of different stuff, and he's just a super smart guy. So we know that, like, if you diet for 5 days, 1 day doesn't get it done, 2 days is required. Well, the question then becomes, right, what happens if I do a 1 day refeed every third day? Like, let's say, not that you're starving, right? Most lean dieters are not using a super large deficit unless masochistic enough to do my rapid fat loss diet, right? They're on a 20-25% calorie deficit. If you add up the numbers, like, right, they're maybe on a 600 calorie deficit, so 6,000 calories every fifth day. We know that it takes, 1, 2, 3, 4 to get the adaptations to start. Well, what if you do 2 days of dieting and then raise calories? Presumably you haven't gotten the same adaptation over 2 days. Maybe you've got none. Again, no one's measured it day to day to day to day, which I wish they would, but we know that it takes about to day 4, day 5. So what if you do 3 days of dieting and 1 day, one higher day at maintenance, and then do 2 days of dieting and 1 day at maintenance, and then a day so that rather than 2 days in a row, you're doing 1 day more frequently? The answer is we don't know. There's no data. There is, the ICR data is provocative and suggestive, but it's mainly in obese individuals. The adaptations tend to not be there. The alternate day fasting data is certainly provocative and interesting. I think some of the folks that are using like Martin Birkin's lean gains approach.
Right.
Like if you're doing the intermittent fasting bit, like he tends to go like maintenance or a little bit over on training days and then a deficit, but it's kind of a daily alternation. Is that preventing it? Other than, I mean, obviously as you lose fat, you're not going to get lean and not have any adaptations. The question is that is it slowing them? Rather than getting that big 5-day drop to 50% that makes your brain go, turn this on, are you at least slowing it where it's more and I'll be damned. I don't remember when it was. That was before 2002. I can tell you factually because it was a physical paper and I haven't been in a library since then. I swear somebody studied this. I swear somebody looked at leptin kinetics doing every other day at maintenance. And I have not been able to find this paper for years. So either I hallucinate it, misinterpret it, or just, it's really aggravated me. But that would be a really interesting study to do to see if, or even on, they're doing lots of alternate day fasting studies. Just do a leptin assay. Just see if leptin, because it's going to drop in a day so much. Like let's say over 5 days it drops 50%. So let's say it's 10% a day. It's probably not, but let's say that it does. Drops 10% and goes back to normal, and drops 11% and goes back to normal, and drops, like, rather than this, you're getting this stair stepping where it's going to go down much more gradually. So one day might work, might be effective done more frequently. Again, it depends on the deficit, it depends on the body fat. It depends on how much training you're doing. That also, rather than 2 days in a row, it allows you to sync that potentially with 2 key workouts during a diet. If you've got some particularly heavy workouts to refill muscle glycogen, it can be rotated. One thing Eric has talked about, and that is in the book, again, this is for women, right? Like earlier in a diet, you may do whatever, you're 15%, you're not getting severe adaptations. Maybe you only need 1 day a week.
Yeah.
You're just not there yet. Now you're at 10 to 12, 8 to 10. It's getting a little bit harder. Maybe now you need 2 days. And where did I start UD2? About 12%. At that point, you probably need 2 days. Could be 2 days in a row. Realize I was trying to get an anabolic rebound to make sure strength went back up, which is why I did. But maybe Wednesday and Saturday, or Tuesday and Friday, or whatever they're spacing, maybe at that point, and then sub 8%. You probably need 3 days a week, and it might be 1 day in the middle and then 2 days on the weekend. And that's basically what he did that's what he does with his female dieters. 20 to 24, 1 day a week. Once you get to like 16 to 20, 2 days a week. And then below 16, you're going to need 3, which makes sense physiologically. But to most people, it makes no sense logically, right? What does everybody know? When you get lean, you got to diet harder. Mm-hmm. Oh, when you get lean, you got to diet less. It seems it's completely counterintuitive, right? You can use a larger deficit early. You need less refeeds. You need less frequent diet breaks. The harder your body is fighting back, the smaller of a deficit you should be using, the more refeeds you should be using, and the more frequent the diet breaks, because the adaptations are coming much harder and faster. And that just goes against dieting logic.
Yeah.
But that's how it should be done. And it's interesting, Eric and I, we did like that huge webinar with the Fit Pro guys. And even before that, right, like I came to these conclusions from the research end, and he came to it from the trying stuff and see what sticks end of things. And what he's reported to me, and it's good that we actually kind of reach the same place from a different point. It makes me feel like not so much of a physiological theorist, like I kind of got to the right place by a different pathway. But what he's seen in his dieters by doing it this way is, like, for the women, they lose their menstrual cycle later in the diet. Like most women, it's a matter of if, not when. Yeah. I'm sorry, it's a matter of when, not if. But they get it much later, which is far healthier. Less muscle loss. Certainly fat loss seems to be more consistent. They don't seem to get like that cortisol-related water retention, because among other benefits, when you raise carbs and eliminate the deficit, cortisol can normalize. And again, anecdotally, UD2 seemed to work pretty well. The way he's dieting people to contest lean certainly fits into that paradigm. So like I said, 1 meal, nothing. 5 hours, forget it. I mean, I guess if you did 5 hours every day, but at that point, you're not really dieting. 1 day might be enough if you do it frequently enough. 2 days if you're doing it less frequently. I mean, you could probably go to 3 and that would be better. But again, at some point you're not dieting, right? And again, he's doing 3 with 1, but in his structure, and again, this is all going to be in the women's book, since you're using a smaller, because what that means is if 3 days are at maintenance to keep the rate of fat loss, your entire deficit has to be on those 4 days, right? And there's a limit to this. You could go, well, why not do 4 days of refeeding it? Well, at that point, you're only dieting for 3 days. If you need a 3,000 calorie deficit, you're on a monster deficit. Like you reach a point of no return. I think 3 days is about the maximum you can get away with that leaves you 4 days of dieting. If you're on a 3,000, it's still a big 800 calorie deficit, but if you're doing a lot of exercise, you're probably going to survive it. But again, as you're getting leaner and the deficit should be shrinking, it's not, early on, bigger deficit, but spread across 6 days. In the middle, deficit's a little bit smaller, spread across 5. At the very end, deficit's smaller, still spread across 4. Mm-hmm. So that kind of sums up where I was in 2004 and where I am in 2017.
Cool. No, I mean, an amazing summary, and so many thoughts were flying through my head as you're going through that. And I mean,
way faster than I usually get through stuff.
Yeah.
Way quicker than normal.
The big question that came into my mind was, I'm glad you touched on kind of the fact that we're not certain on the effect period in terms of like you refeed for 2 days, how long is the effect period? So my question was kind of, if we were, obviously you talked about if you're refeeding those 3 days, then you need a bigger deficit on the other days of the week. If you were to remove those refeed days and just average out your intake and have a linear intake, a linear deficit, is there going to be, are you certain there's a difference there?
I'm absolutely not. Like, I will be completely honest, and I'm absolutely not. It may simply be that like the benefits Eric is seeing that I think are going to be there with with 3 days. It may just be by allowing better training intensity. It may be by reversing, it could just be by preventing you from being exhausted all the time so NEAT doesn't drop. Is it truly resetting resting metabolic rate in enough of a way to, or is it just going to drop right back down on the next day of dieting? I just don't know. I really don't. There's a in-published paper that I kind of helped on that looked at that in some way, but the fact is hormonal assays are not cheap. And the reality is that the research labs that have a lot of money, they don't care about this. So they're not really doing this kind of work. It may come out eventually, but like what you would have to do is measure resting metabolic rate the day before the refeed, the day of the refeed, and the next few days to see how much it went up, if any, and then how much it dropped, how long it took to get back to baseline. That's a lot of money. That's a lot of research. And, ideally you would measure leptin and blood work every day. That's a lot of money. Mm-hmm. Like, Ann Luke's like there, she's clearly got a big grant because she's doing some, she finds that she does blood work and ultrasound to figure out where in the menstrual cycle the women are. They're doing blood work every day. It takes a lot of money. And I think it might unfortunately be a while, before that research is available. Dieters could probably, get a rough idea. Like body temperature is actually a pretty good measure of at least resting metabolic rate, not so much. And they've actually body temperature does go down when you diet because resting metabolic rate goes down, and it's worth about, hang on, I gotta look at my chart. 1 degree centigrade is worth about 10 to 13% on resting metabolic rate. Wow. So if it drops by a degree, if you lose a degree centigrade, you lose about 10 to 13%. And if it goes up, and that's the equivalent of 1.8 degrees Fahrenheit for any non-metric American non-commie listeners, because metric is communist as far as I'm concerned. I can't do it. That's why I got a chart up here on my whiteboard. I'm cheating. So you could technically measure body temperature, and it'll be lower when you're dieting. Dan Duchesne was actually, I think, the first to pioneer this. And people do. They talk about they get super warm on refeeds. Some of that's just the thermic effect of food, but you could probably technically measure your body temperature, see where it goes, and how much longer it takes. I don't know if the thermometers are accurate enough to really pick that up. That would be one possibility. I actually think the study I keep mentioning, I'm pretty sure they had the subjects do that because it's at least illustrative. Mm-hmm. It's not perfect, but at least, we don't know what's changing in terms of non-exercise activity thermogenesis. We don't know what's changing. There are possibilities other than just the leptin hormonal metabolic rate axis, and even if, like we can quibble about the metabolic effects, even without those, the diet adherence, the training intensity, all of that is still worth it, right? Yeah. If the data comes out and says I'm full of it and metabolic rate doesn't, that's fantastic. I'll be the first one to go, yeah, well, so it goes. There's still other benefits, I think. And again, Eric's experience seems to suggest something is going on because since leptin is controlling that menstrual cycle axis for women, the fact that they're clearly losing body fat at the same rate, the fact that they're not losing their cycle till later would seem indirectly to support it. Let's just put it that way.
I guess in a nice way for males at least then, because for females, the refeeds really, according to Eric, have that really beneficial approach. But for males, if you might have someone who psychologically a refeed just sets them off onto maybe a binge cycle or something like that. So they might find they can take the linear approach, whereas someone else might find, they love having that refeed there. That keeps them going potentially.
Yeah, men still have the whole men and women's thing, which again, I'm legally obligated to mention, is like, okay, so you've got a small woman. She's 130 pounds. She's on 1,400 calories. By the time you work out protein and fat, she's maybe eating 125 grams of carbs. If she's training high volume, high frequency, she will become glycogen depleted, right? This is just, it's not a question. Larger men, right? A 170 pound dude or 160 pound guy, he may be eating, what's 12 times 100? It's 1,800. He may be eating 1,800 to 2,000, 2,100 calories a day. By the time you factor in protein and carbs, he may still be at a gram a pound or gram and a half per pound. Just by dint of being larger and being able to eat more, he will probably have enough carbs on a day-to-day basis that refilling muscle glycogen is less of an issue. He's also got the ability to, if it fits your macros in a way the smaller woman can't. And again, I think you see some women talking about it, but it's mainly, let's face it, it's bigger dudes who are doing a lot of exercise. Yeah. These are the guys like, oh yeah, I diet on 2,500 calories a day. Well, of course you can eat a 100-calorie Pop-Tart. You still have 2,400 calories of food. When you're little, you don't get that option. So yeah, there could be a gender difference there. Men just may not need it as frequently. And that's always the issue. For some people, these flexible dieting strategies, whether overweight and just starting or even lean, can cause them to fall off their diet. I've had a lot of people report, they don't like the free meal. It feels like it makes it not a diet day. And they often, depending on how they do it, they frequently have trouble getting back in that mindset. Now, I think that's more of a problem for people starting. This is also a place where I've very much changed my opinions on stuff. And this is more about flexible dieting than refeeds, right? Back in the day, I was like, everyone should do this. This is awesome. This is the best thing since sliced bread. As I've watched people over the last 15 years, for some people, it does more harm than good. I think especially for the beginning dieter, right? They probably have a decade or more of really bad food habits. Their taste buds have to adapt. That takes about 4 to 6 weeks. They also, if they're overweight, are not dealing with the same level of metabolic adaptations. For them, either an ICR approach or just a straight linear diet without the structured flexible, because even the intermittent caloric restriction isn't fast and then eat as much as you want. It's we're going to diet you hard and just eat normally. And what the studies find is people eat about maintenance or maybe a little bit over. When you start to tell people your goal today is to just pump those carbohydrates in, psychologically and physiologically, they do frequently lose control. And especially if they're a little sloppy and eat a lot of dietary fat, you can slow down your fat loss diet. It can be done if you go too nuts. So in that case, women have less of an option if they're having problems with that. I don't know what really the solution so much is. Like they may just have to use the full diet break more frequently. In the full diet break, you've got maintenance calories, you got plenty of room to move. But yeah, men might be able to get away with it a little bit less, the metabolic rate. For men, although it's interesting, and women lose less muscle than men when they diet for a number of reasons. Part of it is hormonal. However, honestly, the big part of it is because they're starting at a higher body fat percentage, right? The body fat percentage is one of the key determinants. Gilbert Forbes did this work back in the day. So here's body fat percentage, here's the proportion of muscle loss, and as body fat percentage goes down, you have a much greater risk to lose lean body mass. Well, if you were to look at a man and a woman at 20% body fat, it'll be basically identical. Women don't get below 10%. So they're in the range that if they're doing certain things, they don't have a big problem with it. Men go into that range where they get into, if you could get a woman from 10 to 4 and she'd be dead, you would probably see the same problems. And there's actually 3 really interesting papers that have just on female physique competitors, and they're all detailed in the book. And in all three of them, nobody lost much, if any, lean body mass.
Wow.
Which really goes against common dieting practices, right? You're going to lose muscle when you diet. Not if you do it right. I've dieted people down to contest lean, men and women, and without muscle loss. You just got to do it right. And in all 3 studies, the women were doing a couple things. A lot of weight training. And B, they were eating about 3 to 3.5 grams per kilo of protein, which is about 1.4 to 1.5 grams per pound, which, I wrote that in my protein book in 2008. So, but yeah, basically they were starting out a little bit fatter, lot of protein, more than most people. Gram per pound. No, sorry, not when you're a lean natural. Maybe if you've got steroids to protect your muscle, but not if you're a lean natural. You need, read Eric Helms's fantastic review. You got to go higher. So they lose very little lean body mass. Men do have that issue. So if the refeeds are helping to ameliorate that by either maintaining training intensity hormonally, so in a sense, they might need it less, or especially early on, but as they get below that 10 to 8% range, they may run into problems. In which case, buy my ultimate diet too, because on the first day, you get to be double maintenance. So even if you go off the rails, it's okay. It's worked into the diet, which actually brings me to another topic that I think is worth addressing.
Yeah.
How many calories do you need, right? This is kind of the final. We've talked about frequency. We've talked about duration. We've talked about body, all this other stuff. The next question is, how many calories do you need? And I think I believe my guide to flexible dieting, I probably put it in grams per kilo, and I generally recommend it above maintenance. Okay. We know, well, let me back up. If you don't get to maintenance, you don't have much of an effect, right? You are still in a deficit. I don't want to go off on the reverse dieting thing. Same problem. If you are still in a deficit, you are still dieting. Until you are at least maintenance calories, you are not dieting. It's the only thing I'm going to say about that. Although actually these women studied, same thing. They found one female dieter took forever to raise her calories, lost her menstrual cycle for 71 weeks, like a year and a half. The other woman raised her calories immediately. She lost her cycle with 1 month to go. She regained it a month after the contest. This whole idea, and they both got fat anyway. They both returned to 24% body fat. You're going to have to let it happen. The faster you raise calories, the faster your body can start hormonal recovery. This woman took 10 weeks after her diet to get even close to maintenance. And she screwed her menstrual cycle for a year and a half. And that's bad. So anyway, same thing with the refeed. You need to be at least at maintenance. Anything less than maintenance will not have much of an effect. Do you have to be over maintenance? That study I mentioned on women would suggest no. They went to 2 days of maintenance and everything recovered just fine. Would being above maintenance have more of an effect? I don't really know. I tend to think so. I tend to think you'll probably pump left and higher in that short term. But that has to be weighed against, now you might be eliminating some of the deficit. Yeah. Although, like I said, UD2 does a neat trick. And there's a study, I don't remember it. There's a study that I based this on. They depleted them for 5 days. Then they refed them carbs for 3 days. An enormous amount, 700 grams, 900, 900. It's probably by Mark Hellerstein. It was a de novo lipogenesis study. And in the first 24 hours, they continued to use fat for fuel because they were refilling muscle glycogen. So at least when you're completely depleted, and UD2 will do that, and you'll hate it, and it's miserable and horrible. And I really write some awful diets as I think about it. I've done them both, and Rapid Fat Loss and Ultimate Diet 2 just suck. They work, but damn, they suck. So anyway, you have to weigh that against, is it potentially slowing down your diet by eliminating some of the deficit? If you've got say you've got a 2,000 weekly net deficit, right? You're dieting over let's say just 6 days in one, just to make it simple. If you go maintenance plus 500, technically you've only got a 1,500 calorie deficit for the day. Now, again, over a 1 day period, certain conditions, you can kind of sidestep that. And it doesn't mean somebody's going to hear this and go, Lyle says energy balance doesn't matter. Mm-hmm. No, energy balance does matter. You're getting a nutrient partitioning effect, which is just allows you to kind of get around this for all of a 24-hour span. You do that for 2 days in a row, you will eliminate the deficit. I can guarantee that. Which was another issue. A lot of people, over a day, you can get away with a lot. Probably too much. I did it. By the time you get to 2 days, if you go really cheat day out of your mind, you can completely eliminate the week's fat loss. Yeah. I did it. Other people did it. Over a short period of time, you can get away, that junk loading thing. If you're super depleted, you can get away with a lot. Over 2 days, you really do need to be emphasizing high carbohydrates, and it needs to actually simpler works better, believe it or not. Insulin is part of this. I generally recommend mostly starchy carbs, throw in some simpler carbs. You can get your treat in, get a little fructose, a little sucrose. Dietary fat should be moderated, maybe 50 grams for smaller women, bigger guys, maybe 75. Because when you're pumping all those carbs in, A, you'll keep losing a little bit of fat, but B, it is possible to start restoring that, which you don't want. Yeah. So really, and that just comes down to, like, if you're going to go over maintenance or not. Are you on a time frame, right? If you're a contest dieter and you've got a competition on December 31st, you cannot get behind. You are on a schedule. In that case, you're probably better off just doing maintenance. Because even slowing fat loss a tiny bit may, especially when you're little, right? When you're dealing with a pound a month or a pound and a half a month, cutting that by 2 or 3/10 of a pound, 2.5 to 3-ish kilos a month. I don't know, half a kilo a week difference, something in that range. Multiply by 2.2. That matters. So if you're a dude or even a female and you're just like, I want to get to 8% as a guy, if it takes me an extra couple weeks, I don't care, then fine, you can go over maintenance. It's fun. I love, I do miss UD2 carb ups. I love going to the grocery store and getting 2 bags of bagels, a bag of cereal, a gallon of milk, and a tub of orange sherbet, fat-free ice cream or jelly beans. And people will just go, man, you eat a lot of carbs. I'm like, that's just today. That was always awesome, although you get really full after a while. So, if you want to do that and run on a time frame, go for it. Just keep dietary fat. Well, you can have a little bit. Have some regular ice cream or some cookies and stuff. Just don't go nuts. If you're on a time schedule, you're probably better keeping it at maintenance. I will also say, because I've seen people do this, a lot of people coming from a clean dieting background, clean eating background, they want to refeed on high fiber foods. Do not do this. A dieter I worked with years ago, I think she tried to do it with All Brand, which is a very high fiber breakfast cereal here. It didn't go well the next day for her. You actually and again, this goes against dieting logic. Oh, I got to eat clean and healthy and all this. And I'm now telling you that for a day, I want you to plug in low fiber, refined bread, starchy carbohydrates, a little bit of junk food, because that's what you have to do. If you're going to put in, 300 grams of carbs and you've been dieting or whatever it is, whatever gram per kilo amount you go with, if you try to do that with nothing but fiber, you're going to have a bad time. So do the bread, do the bagel, sweep it, go do some sushi, whatever floats your boat. Be forewarned, your body weight will spike for about a day because you will hold water. So if you're neurotic about the scale, give it a couple of days till you lower your carbs again. I probably should mention there is something people have tried, which is a dry refeed.
Mm-hmm.
And for people that are holding water, maybe that cortisol thing or whatever, it can frequently trigger a big water loss. If nothing else, it tends to move water into your muscle. However, it sucks because all those carbs are going into the muscle. They're pulling water out of the bloodstream. You are so thirsty. It's just horrific. Like probably the dry refeed is what the 5-hour one should be used for. Like do it you can make it 5 hours. You'll not be suck on some ice cubes. To try to do that for 24 hours is absolutely horrific. I'm sure people have done it. I'm quite sure people have done it, but it will make you, again, you will really hate yourself if you try to do it. And you just kind of keep water kind of as low as you can, as moderate as you can. One other benefit of refeeds I think is worth mentioning, and again, this is for contest dieter, or even the guy that's just like, I want to look good at the beach or whatever, is it lets you practice some peak week schedule. It lets you get an idea of what foods you best respond to. And this sounds like gross, and there's probably a little some people bloat on certain foods. Maybe there's some mild food allergies going on, but if you're doing this weekly, you can dial in a couple things. One, you can dial in what foods you best respond to, so that you look the best. Two, what you can figure out is when you're going to look the best after the carb load. Right. So there's this old idea floating around from mainly the drug era. You finish your carb load on Friday. Well, guess what? As long as you have diuretics to take the water out, that works. And if you don't have diuretics, you're going to look puffy on the Saturday competition. For naturals, that doesn't work. And I've always recommended that naturals should finish their carb load by Thursday at the latest, because they have to have a day to get the water off from underneath their skin. For some people, it might have to be 2 days. And muscle glycogen will stay full for 3 days after a carb load. That has been studied, so that is an experimental finding. You're not going to go flat again. But what you do is you finish your 2-day carb load, refeed, whatever you want to call it, day at maintenance. And then you just visually assess, right? You go back to dieting and you'll probably be on lower or moderated carbs, and you visually assess how many days it takes to look the best. And this is towards the end of the diet. Clearly you have to be lean enough for this to matter. So if it's a day, you need 1 day. If you finish do a carb load on Friday and you don't look great, by that I mean full, good pump, dry, leaned out. If that's not till Monday, well, you just have figured out you personally need 3 days to look your best. This is good information going into peak week because it will adjust how you individually need to schedule that. Mm-hmm. Whether you get by on Thursday, Wednesday, or maybe even Tuesday, you might need, that would be 4 days, but assuming, if Friday is the carb load and Monday mornings that you look best, you need 2 full days and that's the contest. So you would need Thursday, Friday, and then competition day. So that's another real benefit of this.
Yeah,
I don't know if anything else to cover.
No, I think we have covered a lot there. And the only thing I'd say now is just personally, because of listening to, I looked into Ultimate Diet 2.0 and the Rapid Fat Loss Diet because I just ran a peak week in which I hadn't tested it, but it was front loaded. So it wasn't such an issue. We could taper things. Yes. And I ran a week of depletion, and then just the Saturday before the show, which was a week Saturday, I ran 10 times body weight in kilos carbs. And it was a fun day and a fun week.
And I honestly think the Luke study did actually use I think they were at I swear it was 40 to 45 calories per kilo. It was just some I don't even know how they got them. It's 6,400 calories. It was something just ridiculous for small women.
Wow.
But it's fun until the end of the day. We were just I don't think I can eat anymore. I know I got to have another 100 grams, but I don't think I can handle another bagel. There is actually one other topic just because it does come up. So originally, when I came up with this idea, I strongly recommended doing the refeed or the maintenance day, whatever you want to call it, on a training day.
Yes.
There's a number of reasons for that. So let's say you're training in the afternoon, heavy leg workout, whatever it is, and You've gotten to eat beforehand as you kind of start eating some carbs. We know that training tends to increase muscle carbohydrate uptake, GLUT4, insulin sensitivity, blah, 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 blah. So you'll probably get more glycogen storage. Now, one thing to consider is it's only in the muscles that were trained. Right. This is why UD2 had such a weird structure. You did a full body workout before the carb load so that you would load and that's also part of why you get to eat so much more. Mm-hmm. If you're loading the whole body, you can go 10, 12, 16 grams per kilo. If you're only loading an individual muscle group, I'm not saying the other muscles won't absorb carbohydrates. You will get an increased carbohydrate absorption in the muscles by doing it that way. So I generally and you would probably sync that with, like, if you've got a weak point, if you've got a muscle that tends to lose muscle. Some people, it's very general rule of thumb: the muscles that grow the easiest, you will not go away when you diet. And if you have a particularly stubborn muscle group, like your arms don't grow well, they will disappear on a diet. So that, from a sequencing standpoint, is a good way to consider scheduling it. Because if you know that schedule the carb load on that training day so that you can get the most intensity, get the best recovery, and have the best chance of protecting it on a diet. But then I saw some people kind of playing with this idea, and admittedly, it's usually performance athletes, usually power lifters, Olympic lifters, less so physique competitors, and realized that the goals are totally different. For physique, performance per se, yes, I want you to maintain your training intensity. However, performance per se is not the end metric. For a powerlifter, Olympic lifter, being able to do their heavy day is the end metric. And again, UD2 program this in. You do kind of you get depletion days, which are light and high rep and suck, and then you do like this 6 to 8 rep day, full body to set up the carb load, and then your strong is all hell on Saturday. And I've seen powerlifters and Olympic lifters set PRs while they were dieting, and that just doesn't happen with normal diets. But what some people started doing was doing their maintenance or refeed or carb load day the day before a heavy training session. Right? Because the carbs you eat in the morning even won't really be available, right? If you train legs at 4, if you train legs again the next day, you'd feel fantastic. However, the carbs won't be available for that training session until the next day once you've stored the glycogen. So that is another option more for performance athletes. And they're probably what I would actually do is, because again, we know that even light training tends to increase muscle glycogen storage. So let's say you've got your heavy Saturday squat day, whatever, you're West Side for life, you got to make weight class, you got to go do your max effort work on Saturday morning. Maybe Friday, do a very light leg workout. I mean super light. I mean a couple high rep sets that don't even fatigue you, work capacity. Then do your maintenance day, and you will fill those muscles up with glycogen and water, which will you'll get an increase in strength just from the mechanical effects, just because, without getting into it, when you fill up the muscle, you're changing blah, blah, fascicle length and this and all that other, get Brad Schoenfeld on here to talk about all that stuff. But you will get a mechanical increase in your strength, and you will feel strong as hell for the key workout. So that would be a case for a dieting performance athlete versus a dieting physique athlete. Yeah. On that vein, to kind of finish up, let's say you've got a weak body point. Let's say you are going to do the almost futile attempt to bring it up during a diet. It's not unheard of. You're not going to gain an inch on your arms, but you might gain enough to maybe look a little bit better, right? People on UD2 did gain muscle because they were carb loaded for that 2.5 day span. They were anabolic because they were at or above maintenance. That's why I set it up that way. You cannot be anabolic on a diet by definition without drugs. You are catabolic by definition. So what you could do, let's say you got a weak body point. We know that when you train, you get increased, protein synthesis goes up for 24, 36 hours, maybe a little less if you're well trained. Well, let's say you've got 2 refeed days or 2 carb load days a week. Well, you train your weak point on Friday, and that's day 1 of your refeed. You start in the morning, you're strong, you get increased glycogen storage. Do your second day of refeeding on Saturday. So you are staying in a more anabolic state for at least that 48 or 36 hours. You can train in the morning even better, because then you get a good 48 hours. Are you going to get a huge effect? No. Are you going to maybe get some effect? Maybe. I hope so, but that would be another consideration in terms of whether you're doing one day if you've got one day during the week and 2 days on the weekend, you're golden. Put this on a particularly heavy day, do your 2 days and put a weak point on that Friday or whatever you want to do, and you can sort of get the best of all worlds.
Just the final note I wanted to touch on there was, because obviously we've talked about general refeeds, and then you talked about like UD2 and the carb load, and that was a big amount of carbs. I just want to touch for the listeners so they're not thinking they can have the carb load is relational to kind of the depletion that you've ran beforehand.
Correct. Yes, and that's where you get kind of into what training you're doing, right? If you're UD2 uses a very specific structure. Monday and Tuesday you do roughly 12 sets of 15 to 20 per muscle group on a short rest period. Like you are trying to deplete glycogen to something like, half or 3/4 of its normal level. You do the final workout on Thursday, which is moderate volume. You're trying to drop glycogen from its normal levels to like 25% of normal deliberately. When you are that depleted, you can do the old endurance thing and you can crank in 12 to 16 grams per kilo because you're setting it up with a full body workout. You are storing carbs in every muscle that have been completely depleted. If you are not doing that, if you are not doing that kind of volume during the week, and some physique competitors maybe, I suspect most aren't and more shouldn't. And this is Eric and I, this is probably our we've been arguing about this for a year, debating whether you should reduce volume on a diet, change volume. He likes to maintain it. I recommend people reduce it, replace heavy training with depletion. The difference comes down to he's training people in person and he can watch what's happening and adjust it. I'm writing a book for people that don't follow instructions because I've got way too much experience and I know I have to predict what they will do wrong.
Yeah.
And that sounds really smug and really smarmy, but it's not. I've just seen it. The number of people I've seen take a paragraph that says this and go, so I should do the exact opposite is immense. I know what people do because I did it all, right? I know that people try to do every set and every rep on a diet. And it's like, look, if you're cooked, go home. And they don't, and they overtrain and they burn out and they get hurt. And those are not good ways to lose body fat. So I tend to proactively reduce volume or replace heavy volume with some depletion. Nice. He tends to maintain heavy volume for as long as possible. But again, I'm writing in a book and I don't know who the person is. Yeah. He's writing he's training people. It's very different. So anyway, UD2 is very specific to doing complete full body depletion over 4 days. You're using less than 50 grams of carbs a day. You're doing like the old endurance style depletion. In that situation, you can pump in for a day.
Yeah.
And then day 2, you're at maintenance or a tiny bit above. And then on day 3, spend about half the day eating and then you go back to dieting. So very different than the average contest dieter who is not doing that volume, who's not explicitly depleting their glycogen. For them, just from a safety valve standpoint, it's probably better to keep it at maintenance. Yeah, you a little above. If you want to go a couple hundred calories and have that extra 50 grams of fat-free yogurt or whatever, it's not going to kill you. If you go from 2,000 to 4,000 and you're not depleted, you may get yourself into problems.
Okay. Yeah, perfect. No, I think that's a really good way to end it. And I think people have hopefully taken a lot away from this and kind of have got the 101 on refeeds now and where we stand. And I really hope all of the studies you speak about kind of hopefully coming out in future, and the one you're kind of working on at the moment, I can't wait for those ones to come out, because if there are ways to make contest prep dieting or even just dieting in general for people better, especially for females, because it is a hard process. That's fantastic. So I just want to say thank you for coming on, sharing all your work. And where do you want people to contact you? I know last time we said, I think the Facebook group's really good.
I'm most active. And again, I always like to point out, I tend to attract a lot of people that have a great deal of expertise in their fields. Like I tend to be very much a generalist, and I have some stuff I'm very strong on, but like rehab, we've got a woman in there who is basically an active OBGYN on the female issues I can't handle. She will always kick in. We've got a couple of great physiotherapists, a couple physicians, like anything that I can't address. And I mean, I learn from them, make no mistake. I will farm out questions to them that I don't have the answer to. So the Facebook group, which is called Body Recomposition, is extremely active. My website, bodyrecomposition.com, that's where all my over 500 some odd articles are. And you can get my books there. So really, those are the two best places.
Perfect. I'll make sure.
You can email me a question through the website, but realistically, I probably won't get to it.
Well,
I've got like 65 until I do a mailbag. I got like 65 sitting in there. So
I'm not surprised. I get enough questions personally, so you must get a ridiculous number.
Yeah, there's just it's not me being rude.
No.
It's just there's only so much time I just can't address. Like I try to, when I run out of article topics, I tend to do a quickie Q&A mailbag because I can usually do those a lot faster.
So I'll make sure those are all linked below. And I mean, I'd love to get you on again. And if people have got questions, I mean, if you're happy to come on again at some point, if there's a common question that we can find and that we want to put a nail in the coffin for, then I think that'll be a really good thing. So if people have got questions, maybe comment below, and I'll make sure that we can get you on again, Lyle, and share some more knowledge.
Maybe we can talk about the new study on branched chain amino acids that point out that they're crap. That'd be a good one. Isolated branch chains. But anyway, that's for another day.
Yeah, brilliant. Right. I want to thank everyone for listening in. I want to thank Lyle again for coming on, and we will catch you soon.
Okie doke. Thanks, Stephen.